The courtroom was ice cold, but the burn inside my chest was unbearable. I stood there, frozen, as the judge's gavel came down and shattered what little I had left. My husband, no, my ex-husband now, smirked like he'd just won a game. The court had granted him full custody of our 2 children and ownership of our $5.5 million Los Angeles mansion. When I turned to look at him, he leaned close enough for only me to hear and whispered, "You'll never see them again." Then he smiled for the cameras. Reporters flashed lights, his lawyer shook his hand, and I just stood there, clutching my empty hands. Wondering how my life had fallen apart so fast, I didn't cry in that courtroom. I waited. I gathered the fragments of my dignity, packed 2 suitcases, and drove out of the city, to my late father's old, quiet house. The one place that still felt like home, even if it smelled of dust and forgotten memories. That night, sitting in his cold basement, surrounded by the echoes of my childhood, I found something hidden behind an old cabinet. A steel safe, the combination, my birthday, and inside, a letter that began with 7 words that made my heart stop. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Would you forgive what life took from you, or take it all back in your own way? There was a time I thought I had everything. A beautiful home in Los Angeles with glass walls that caught the sunrise every morning. 2 children whose laughter could light up even the darkest rooms, and a husband who, at least from the outside, seemed like every woman's dream. Michael had that kind of charm that made people listen when he spoke. At business dinners, he was the man with the winning smile and the sharp wit. The kind of man who made waiters rush and neighbors wave. I used to watch him from across crowded rooms, thinking, that's my husband. That's my life. We had the house on the hill, the beach vacations, the charity galas where everyone pretended to be happy and successful. I played the part of the supportive wife perfectly. I gave up my marketing career when our son was born, telling myself it was temporary. But years passed, and somehow, temporary became permanent. Michael liked it that way. He said he needed me home. Needed me to focus on the kids, the house, him. At the time, it felt like love. But looking back, it was control disguised as devotion. It started small. He'd criticize how I dressed when we went out. "That color doesn't suit you, babe." He'd say, all smiles, but his hand would linger just a little too firmly on my arm. Later, he'd make jokes in front of friends about how I couldn't survive without him. And I'd laugh along, embarrassed but trying to keep the peace. Behind closed doors, the mask slipped more often. If dinner wasn't perfect, if the kids were noisy, if I disagreed with him even slightly, his voice would drop into that cold, measured tone that made my stomach twist. "You'd be nothing without me," he'd say, sometimes softly, almost like a fact. Still, I stayed. I told myself he was stressed, overworked. That I'd married a good man buried under pressure. I didn't want to believe the truth, that my life had quietly become a gilded cage. There were moments, though, when the illusion cracked. I'd catch him on late, night phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. He'd delete messages from his phone and tell me I was getting paranoid. The distance between us grew so gradually I barely noticed it until we were strangers sharing the same bed. My father used to visit sometimes. He'd sit on the patio with his coffee, eyes quietly scanning the house, the cars, the life I thought was perfect. He never said much, but once, after Michael had stormed out during an argument, Dad placed his hand on mine and said, "Sweetheart, money makes noise, but real peace is silent. You've got to listen for the difference." I didn't understand it then. I just smiled and brushed it off. But now, looking back, I think he saw everything I was too blind, or too scared, to admit. The last family photo we took before everything fell apart sits in a dusty frame somewhere. Michael's arm is around my waist. The kids are laughing, and the sun is setting behind us. It looks perfect. But every time I see it in my mind, I can still hear the echo of my dad's words. Sometimes, I think my dad saw the truth before I ever did, because beneath that perfect smile and the picture, perfect life, the foundation of my world was already cracking. And I was too busy pretending to be happy to notice the storm that was coming. It started with a whisper. A phone left unlocked, a message that popped up late one night while Michael was in the shower. Just one line. "I can't wait to see you again." No name, no heart emoji, just enough to make my world stop spinning for a moment. I wish I could say I confronted him right away, that I demanded answers. But instead, I sat there on our perfect marble floor, staring at that glowing screen, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. Because deep down, I already knew. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things. The new cologne, the late nights, at work, the sudden bursts of irritation when I asked simple questions. One day, I followed him. I told myself I just wanted peace of mind, but what I found tore me apart. There he was, my husband of 17 years, sitting at a restaurant, laughing, touching hands across the table with a woman half my age. His assistant. The same woman who used to call me Mrs. Reeves, with fake sweetness, whenever she came by our home office. I didn't make a scene. I didn't burst in or throw water in his face like in the movies. I just stood outside, invisible, my whole life unraveling in silence. But the affair was only part of it. When I finally gathered the courage to confront him, he didn't even deny it. He smiled. That same cold, mocking smile I used to mistake for confidence. And said, "You're overreacting. You're lucky anyone still wants you." The next morning, I found out he'd already been preparing for this moment. He had drained our joint savings. Every account I thought we shared, and moved the funds into accounts under his name and his company's. He'd even convinced me months earlier to sign what he called routine business documents. That turned out to be asset transfers. I had unknowingly signed away my security, my safety net, my independence. When I hired a lawyer, she took one look at the paperwork and said quietly, "He's setting you up to lose everything." I laughed bitterly, not because it was funny, but because the reality was too heavy to cry over anymore. The divorce hearings were a nightmare. Michael showed up with a team of attorneys. Expensive, polished, ruthless. They smiled like they were about to dismantle me piece by piece, and they did. They twisted every word I said, painted me as unstable, emotional, unfit. They used the fact that I hadn't worked in years as proof that I couldn't provide for my children. My decision to stay home, the sacrifice I made for our family, was suddenly a weapon against me. Michael sat there every day, calm and collected, playing the part of the wounded husband. His lawyers claimed he was concerned about my ability to care for the kids. And my children, God, my children. I'll never forget the way they looked at me on the stand. Confused, distant, almost scared. Later I found out Michael had told them I was sick, that I needed help, that it was better for them to stay with him. For now. He'd bought their affection with gifts and guilt. He made me the villain in my own home. When the verdict came, it was like the air was sucked out of the courtroom. Michael got everything. The $5.5 million mansion, full custody of the kids, and control over our remaining assets. I got a small settlement and supervised visitation rights. The judge said it was in the children's best interest. I wanted to scream that nothing about this was fair, but my voice was gone. Michael leaned in as we stood up to leave and whispered, his breath warm against my ear, "You'll never see them again." Then he smiled. In that same courtroom where I had just lost my family, my home, my entire life. As I walked out, reporters swarmed the steps. Flashes went off like tiny explosions. Questions were shouted over each other. How do you feel about the ruling? Did your husband cheat? Will you appeal? I didn't answer. I just kept walking, holding back tears, clutching the divorce papers like they were the last pieces of my dignity. That night, I packed my life into 2 suitcases and left the city lights behind. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay in the place where everything had been taken from me. The man I loved destroyed me in front of a judge and smiled while doing it. The drive out of Los Angeles felt endless. The city lights shrinking in my rearview mirror until they were nothing but fading ghosts. I drove through the night in silence, 2 suitcases in the back seat, my heart heavier than anything I'd packed. My father's old countryside house was the only place left that still had my name on it. Untouched since his passing 3 years ago. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the porch light was long dead, and the wooden steps creaked under my feet. The air smelled like dust and pine. The same wind that used to carry my father's laughter now whispered through the trees, low and lonely. Inside, everything was frozen in time. His coat still hung on the rack. His old radio sat by the window, where he used to listen to the morning news with a mug of black coffee. The faint scent of engine oil and wood polish clung to the air. His scent. For a moment, I wasn't the broken, humiliated woman who'd lost everything. I was just his little girl again. The one who'd sit on the porch steps while he fixed things in the yard and told me stories about how life tests you right before it blesses you. I remember one of his sayings most vividly. When the world turns its back on you, listen to the silence. It has answers. At the time, I didn't understand it. But standing there, surrounded by the quiet echo of everything I'd lost, his words suddenly made sense. I spent the next few days cleaning. It was all I could do to keep from falling apart. I swept, dusted, washed. as if order on the outside might bring peace inside. Every drawer I opened was a time capsule. My old sketchbooks from school, a cracked snow globe from our trip to Tahoe, a faded photo of Mom and me in the garden, both of us covered in dirt and laughter. Then there was the basement. I had avoided it for years. Even as a child, it had always felt different, colder, heavier. But I needed a place to set up my things, so one afternoon, I finally opened the creaking door and went down. The basement smelled of damp earth and old paper. The single hanging bulb flickered to life, casting a dull orange glow. Cobwebs laced the corners. Boxes were stacked high, labeled in my father's careful handwriting. Tools, taxes, memories, Sarah's things. I knelt beside one labeled Sarah's things and started sorting. My childhood drawings, stick figures of me and Dad holding hands, yellowed but still intact. My first diary, the one I hid under my bed when I was 13. A birthday card from him with his unmistakable scrawl. To my sunshine, don't let anyone dim your light. Tears blurred my vision. I wiped them away and kept working, moving old boxes, furniture, and forgotten pieces of my past. That's when I saw it, an old oak cabinet, tall, heavy. Its varnish peeling with time, pressed tight against the back wall. I remembered it vaguely. My dad used to keep it locked, saying it held boring grown up stuff. But when I tried to move it, the bottom scraped oddly against the floor, like something was blocking it. I pushed harder. The wood groaned, the cabinet tilted forward slightly, and that's when I saw it. Behind it, half hidden in the shadows, was a small steel safe built into the wall. The metal was cold and slightly rusted, but intact. My heart began to pound. I crouched down and brushed the dust away. There was a combination lock. Old, analog, the kind with a single dial. I stared at it for a long moment, my fingers trembling. Dad never mentioned a safe. Ever. I tried a few random numbers. Our old house address, his birthday, the year Mom died. Nothing. The dial refused to budge. I sighed, leaning my forehead against the cold steel. And then, almost without thinking, I whispered, "What would you do, Dad?" My eyes fell on a small photo on the floor. One of me at my 10th birthday, standing beside him with a lopsided cake. My birthday. I hesitated, then slowly turned the dial to the numbers of my birth date. Month, day, year. The dial clicked. Once, twice. Then, a deep, heavy clunk. My breath caught in my throat. The safe door loosened. I reached out, hands shaking, and pulled it open. Inside was a neatly folded envelope, yellowed at the edges but sealed tightly with wax. On the front, in my father's unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that sent chills down my spine. If you're reading this, it's time. For a long time, I just stared at the open safe. Dust motes floated through the thin shaft of basement light, catching the glint of the old metal box like tiny ghosts. Inside were neat stacks of aged documents, small velvet envelopes, and a sealed letter with my name written across it. Sarah. In my father's steady, careful handwriting. I could almost hear his voice again, gentle but commanding. If you ever need to find strength, look where I taught you to listen, in the silence. My hands shook as I lifted the envelope. The paper was yellowed and soft from time. When I cracked the wax seal, a faint scent of engine oil and tobacco drifted out. Him. The first line hit me like a whisper from another world. If you're reading this, I'm gone. I pressed my lips together, tears instantly welling in my eyes. I hadn't cried at his funeral. Not really. I'd been too numb, too consumed with holding everything together for everyone else. But now, with his words in front of me, the dam finally broke. Tears slid down my cheeks as I read on. I know life has broken you, Sarah. And if you've come back here, it means the world's turned its back on you. But I never did. I left something to help you rebuild. I paused, wiping my eyes, the words blurring as my breath trembled. He had known. Even years ago, before everything fell apart. Before Michael's betrayal. Before the courts. Before I was left with nothing. My father had somehow known that I would need this moment. Inside the envelope were 2 old photographs. One of him standing beside a sign that read Crimson Harbor Industries, 1994. And another of him with a group of men in suits, shaking hands in front of a warehouse. Behind the photos were official-looking bank documents. Stock certificates, investment statements. Legal letters from an old law firm in San Diego. As I read through them, my heart began to race. My father had secretly invested in a shipping company back in the 90s. Crimson Harbor, one that had later been acquired by an international logistics giant. The numbers were surreal. The value of those shares now was in the millions. The letter continued, I never told anyone about this, not even your mother. I didn't want greed to poison what we had. But this is your inheritance, Sarah. Not for luxury, for freedom. To stand again when life tries to bury you. I gasped softly, clutching the pages to my chest. My father. The quiet, modest man who wore the same flannel shirts for years and drove his old truck until it rusted. Had left me a fortune. Not out of vanity, but out of love. And yet, something in the way the letter ended felt unfinished. There was a second, smaller envelope taped to the back of the first one. On it, in the same trembling handwriting, were 4 words, for when you're ready. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a small USB drive and a note written in darker ink. There are things I never told you. About Michael. My stomach dropped. I hurried upstairs to find my old laptop, my heart pounding in my ears. When I plugged the drive in, it opened a folder labeled, "A for Sarah, Truth." Inside were several voice recordings, dated 2 years before my father's death. I clicked the first one. His voice filled the quiet room. Tired, heavy, deliberate. It's Thomas Miller. I'm documenting this because I have reason to believe my daughter's husband, Michael Harris, is using client accounts to move large sums of money off record through Crimson Harbor. He's been accessing funds through shell companies. I've gathered copies of the transactions. I froze. My father had known about Michael's schemes. Years ago. The next recording was shorter, more fragmented. If anything happens to me, this information must go to Sarah. She deserves to know who she's married to. I scrolled through the files. Spreadsheets, scanned ledgers, even screenshots of bank transfers. Michael's name appeared again and again, tied to offshore accounts and fake charities. My entire body went cold. All those nights when Michael claimed to be working late. The sudden bursts of wealth. The trips overseas, he said, were for business. It was all right there. He hadn't just betrayed me as a wife. He had committed crimes under my father's nose. And my father, the man Michael had dismissed as a washed-up old mechanic, had been the one quietly gathering the proof all along. I sank into the old armchair, clutching the letter, the USB drive, and the weight of a truth that shattered everything I thought I knew. My voice cracked as I whispered into the empty room, "Dad, you didn't just leave me memories. You left me justice." The house creaked around me, and for a fleeting moment, I could almost swear I heard his voice again. Calm, steady, full of quiet strength. "Now you know what to do, sunshine." And in that instant, my heartbreak hardened into resolve. Michael thought he'd taken everything. He had no idea what was coming. For the first time in months, I woke up with purpose, not hope. That felt too fragile, but purpose. My father hadn't just left me money. He'd left me ammunition. The next morning, I dialed a number I found scribbled at the bottom of his letter. "Call Richard Hayes, trustworthy." It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Hayes speaking." "Mr. Hayes," I said softly. "My name is Sarah Miller. Thomas Miller's daughter." There was a long pause on the line, then a sigh that carried both surprise and warmth. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said. "Your father told me this day might come." We met the next day at a quiet diner on the edge of town. The kind of place where nobody cared who you were, just whether you wanted more coffee. He was an older man now, silver hair, thick glasses, a face that looked like it had carried secrets for decades. When I showed him the letter, the documents, and the USB drive, his expression hardened. "Thomas warned me about your husband years ago," he said, flipping through the files. "Michael was clever, hid behind shell companies, funneled money through dummy accounts. But your father collected enough to ruin him." My pulse quickened. "So we can prove it." "Oh, we can prove it," he said, leaning in. "But we're not going to rush. We're going to bury him the same way he buried you. Quietly, piece by piece. And that's how the plan began. Richard contacted a small network of forensic accountants. Discreet professionals who still owed my father favors. They verified the authenticity of every document, every recording, every transaction. One by one, the pieces started to fit. The numbers were staggering. Michael had laundered nearly $8 million through fake charities, using my father's old shipping routes as cover. He had tied my name to some of the accounts, trying to ensure that if the truth ever came out, I would take the fall. But now, the tables were turning. We compiled a dossier, carefully labeled, indexed, cross-referenced, every piece of evidence marked with my father's handwriting and date, stamped proof. Then, at Richard's suggestion, we began feeding it. Not to the police, not yet, but to the wolves, journalists, regulatory agencies, and anonymous tip lines that specialized in corporate crime. One email at a time. One document at a time. Each drop designed to look accidental until it wasn't. Meanwhile, I played my role perfectly. To the world, to Michael, I was the broken ex-wife. The woman he'd beaten in court. The pathetic figure living in her dead father's basement. He bragged about me in interviews. telling magazines how some people just can't move on. I didn't respond. I didn't post anything. I didn't fight back. Not visibly. But in the shadows, I watched his empire tremble. Every time he smiled for the cameras, another anonymous document landed in a reporter's inbox. Every time he attended a gala, another transaction trail appeared in a tax investigator's office. Richard warned me to be patient. "Don't tip your hand too early," he said. "He'll crumble faster when he still thinks he's safe." So, I waited. And every night, when the silence settled and the old house creaked around me, I'd look at my father's photograph on the wall and whisper, "You were right, Dad. I'm listening." Because the silence was speaking, and what it told me was clear. Michael thought he'd won. He thought I was gone. But he didn't know I was just getting started. It started with a headline. I was sipping cheap coffee in my father's kitchen when the news alert flashed across the screen of my old laptop. Business tycoon Michael Reeves, under federal investigation for fraud and money laundering. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My fingers trembled as I clicked the article. There it was. His name. His company. The same company that once funded our mansion, our vacations, our perfect life. The story spread like wildfire. Investigators had discovered shell corporations in the Caymans, fraudulent charitable donations, and falsified invoices. Every detail, every number, came from the evidence I'd quietly fed into the system. Within hours, the story hit every major outlet. By nightfall, the stock price of his company had collapsed. By morning, federal agents had raided his office. And for the first time in years, I smiled. Michael tried to contain the damage. He went on TV, pretending to be the victim of false accusations, his voice shaking just enough to sound rehearsed. But the journalists tore him apart. His bank accounts were frozen, his luxury cars seized, his $5.5 million marital home, the one he'd stolen from me, placed under federal hold. The mansion he had ripped away from me was now surrounded by police tape. Poetic justice. Reporters camped outside his gates, cameras flashing, microphones in his face. "Mr. Reeves, is it true your wife provided the evidence?" His expression, that mask of superiority, finally cracked. I watched it all on TV, sitting cross-legged on the same basement floor where I'd once cried myself to sleep. Only now, I wasn't crying. I was calm, cold, almost serene. A week later, his new girlfriend, the one he left me for, released a statement through her lawyer. She had no idea. It read, "She's devastated by the betrayal." In other words, she'd left him too. Friends distanced themselves overnight. Board members resigned. His name, once whispered with admiration in business circles, became a cautionary tale. And the best part, he couldn't even access his money to fight back. Remember that clause in my father's letter? The one about the assets. Most of his wealth had been loaned through my father's private trust. Legally, it reverted back to me the moment his fraud became public. He didn't just lose everything. He lost everything to me. The call came late one evening. I almost didn't answer. "Sarah." His voice was raw, broken. "Please, I need your help." I didn't speak. I just listened. "I can't access the accounts," he said, his words cracking. "The kids, the house, it's all falling apart. You have to talk to them. You can fix this. Funny. The last time I saw him, he'd looked me dead in the eyes and said, 'You'll never see your kids again.' Now, that same man was begging me to save him. I finally spoke, my tone cold and steady. 'Michael, you always said I was useless. I guess you were wrong.' Silence. Then the faint sound of him choking back tears. 'You win,' he whispered. 'No,' I said quietly. 'This isn't a game. This is what happens when you destroy the people who loved you.' I hung up before he could say another word. The next morning, I watched the live footage as he was escorted from his mansion in handcuffs. Reporters shouting, cameras flashing. The same courtroom where I'd once been humiliated now echoed with his downfall. And I didn't even have to lift a finger. As the world watched him crumble, one line kept playing in my head, one he had thrown at me not long ago. "You'll never see them again." Now, he was the one no one wanted to see. And, for the first time since that awful day in court, I whispered to myself, not out of bitterness, but out of closure. The man who told me I'd never see my kids again was now the one begging me for mercy. The courtroom felt different this time. No reporters, no flashing cameras, no cruel whispers, just sunlight streaming through tall windows, falling across the wooden benches like a quiet blessing. I sat there, hands clasped, heart pounding, waiting for the judge to speak. "After reviewing the evidence," he said, his voice steady, "and considering the best interests of the children, full custody is hereby granted to the mother, Sarah Reeves." For a second, the words didn't register. They just hung in the air. Heavy, sacred, unreal. Then I heard it again, full custody granted. Tears blurred everything. My lawyer touched my arm, smiling softly. "You did it, Sarah." But it wasn't victory I felt. It was peace. The kind that comes after surviving a storm so violent, you stop believing in calm. Outside the courthouse, my children were waiting. Quinn and Lily. Taller than I remembered, older somehow, as if pain had forced them to grow faster. The moment Lily saw me, she broke into a run. "Mum." I barely caught her before she crashed into my arms, sobbing against my shoulder. Quinn hesitated for a second, that teenage uncertainty, then wrapped his arms around both of us. For a long time, none of us spoke. We just stood there, breathing, holding on like we were afraid to let go again. When Quinn finally pulled back, his voice cracked just a little. "Mum, were you always this strong?" I smiled through tears. "No, sweetheart. I just didn't have a choice." That night, we stayed at my father's house, the same house that had witnessed my worst pain and my greatest awakening. The basement door was still there, but it no longer frightened me. It no longer held secrets. It held purpose. Because a few months later, I turned that basement into something new, something alive. The Haven House. A shelter for women who'd lost everything. Their homes. Their dignity, their hope, to men who'd convinced them they were powerless. We painted the walls soft cream, added secondhand couches, warm lights, and a long table where women could share stories over coffee. The safe that had once guarded my father's secret fortune was gone, replaced by a bookshelf filled with journals written by survivors who'd found their voices again. It wasn't just a home. It was a rebirth. Every time a woman arrived, broken and trembling like I once was, I'd take her downstairs, show her the light that filtered through the small basement window, and say, "This is where my story began again. Yours will, too." The house, once haunted by grief, now echoed with laughter. Children visiting their mothers on weekends, volunteers cooking dinners, the hum of life returning to the place where mine almost ended. One evening, as I watched the sunset spill gold across the yard, I thought of my father, his letter, his faith, the way he'd prepared for a day I didn't even know I'd need. I whispered softly to the wind, "You were right, Dad." The silence did have answers. The world had taken everything from me once. My home, my name, my children. But in losing it all, I found something deeper. Strength, purpose, redemption. The same basement that held my father's secret now held my legacy. And as I turned off the lights that night, I realized I wasn't living in my father's shadow anymore. I was walking in his light. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening. The kind of night when the sky feels heavy and full of unfinished stories. The knock came just after sunset. Slow, reluctant, like the person on the other side wasn't sure they deserved to be there. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him. Michael, the man who once strutted through courtrooms in $1,000 suits, now stood before me drenched, unshaven. The arrogance was gone. His eyes, once cold and calculating, were hollow. "Sarah," he rasped. "Please." I didn't know where else to go. For a moment, I said nothing. The sound of rain filled the silence between us. Behind me, I could hear my kids laughing faintly upstairs. The sound of life, of warmth, of everything he'd once sworn I'd never have again. He looked past me, desperate. "The house is gone. The cars, the company, all seized. They're saying I might go to prison. I just need to see them. To see the kids." I let his words hang in the air. Then, slowly, I stepped aside just enough for him to glimpse the light from the dining room. 2 plates on the table, the smell of pasta, a soft melody playing in the background. "You once said I'd never see my kids again," I said quietly. A pause. Then I smiled, calm, composed. "Funny, they're upstairs, waiting for dinner." His face crumpled. For the first time, I saw real regret. Not the performance he used to charm judges or investors, but the raw collapse of a man realizing his empire had been built on lies. "Sarah, please." But I was already turning away. "You made your choices," I said, voice steady. "Now live with them." I closed the door before he could answer. Through the rain, streaked window, I watched him fall to his knees on the porch. A broken man surrounded by the ruins of his own making. The same man who once took everything from me was now begging for the smallest piece of mercy. And I had none left to give. The music swelled in my head, slow, cinematic final. I lost my home, my family, my pride. But in that basement, I found my strength. And this time, no one's taking it away. I turned off the porch light. His figure faded into the storm, because justice doesn't always come from the court. Sometimes, it comes from the grave. We all have moments when life rips something out of our hands. A home, a family, a future we thought was certain. And in that moment, you have two choices. You can crumble, or you can rebuild. Tell me, if you lost everything to someone you trusted, what would you do? Would you take revenge? Or would you wait for karma to find its way back around? Do you believe justice always wins on its own, or does it sometimes need a little push? A beat of silence, rain fading, piano slowing, because sometimes the universe doesn't balance the scales for you. You have to do it yourself, piece by piece, truth by truth. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if you've ever been broken and had to rise again, I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me your story, and if you love tales of betrayal, strength, and redemption, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next.